After about 15 years of service, it was time to move on from our current dining room table. We had dinner at it almost every night, and with 3 kids, it was showing a lot of wear. Plus, it was made from some kind of fake wood, and that stuff doesn't typically age that well. So I'm going to make us a table. And this one's going to be real wood, solid wood, walnut to be exact. The boards you just saw were for the tabletop, and most of them are narrow enough to fit on my 6-inch joiner. But the ones that are not, I have to take over to the bandsaw and rip off about a 1/2 inch. Now, the reason I'm doing it at the bandsaw instead of table saw is because these boards are rough cut, and I just feel a lot safer doing it at the bandsaw rather than table saw. Now's a good time to mention that my shop is about 20 feet deep, and these boards are about 10 feet long. So in order to rip the board in one pass, I had to have my bandsaw right in the middle of the shop. And obviously mine wasn't, so I had to flip the board over to cut out those last few inches. As a side note, I could have just opened the garage door too, but that'd be too easy. And speaking of easy, wheels. When you have a small shop, make sure everything is on wheels. It's the best way to get the most use out of a small space. And I learned my lesson from the bandsaw. This time I'm measuring to make sure that my joint is in the middle of my shop. And a little money saving tip. No need to buy those expensive push blocks. These are just standard grout floats that you can get at any big box store. They hold your workpiece great, they protect your hands. This is the only thing I use with the joiner. I use them with the router table too. And those rollers are there for in-feet and out-feet support. Because honestly, these boards are probably too long for this joiner, but with those rollers, we can make it work. After several passes through the joiner to flatten one side of the faces for these boards, we'll send them through the planer to make the other side parallel. And this is probably my favorite part in the milling process, because it's the first time that you really get to see what you're working with in terms of grain. After addressing both faces of the boards, I'm not going to do the edges just yet. In fact, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to stack and sticker the boards so they'll have ample airflow. I'm going to give them a couple of days and see if they move. Since I removed a decent amount of material with the joining and the planing of the faces, there's a chance that some tension was removed during the process. So the boards may shift to find a new equilibrium. So I'm just going to let these boards rest. Let them do what they do. Just going to sing them a lullaby and tell them good night, because I have a big day coming up. So, good news. The boards didn't really move. So now we're on to cleaning out knot holes and voids and filling them up with epoxy. And I'm not really an epoxy kind of guy, but for some reason, I find this part of the build process oddly satisfying. And when working with epoxy, I like to do a few things. I like to pour slowly and repeatedly so that the epoxy can find its level and fill all the little air pockets and things. I also like to make sure that I overfill the holes because epoxy will shrink as it cures. I also like to tape up any sides close to where I'm going to be pouring because those voids can run surprisingly far and epoxy will be oozing out of places you didn't even know were voids. This part's probably not necessary, but it's fun, so maybe it is necessary. I guess some epoxy bubbles pop on their own, but I honestly don't know if this is that type of epoxy or not, so I just pop them anyway, just to be safe. Now after the epoxy cures, I run the boards through the planer. Actually, I do this process twice. After I run them through the planer the first time, turn the boards over, fill those voids with epoxy, let that cure, and run through again. At which point, I'll take them down to their final thickness. Now there are a lot of woodworkers better than me that wait until they glue up the tabletop to fill the voids with epoxy. I have no idea why they do it that way. So if you're one of those woodworkers that does the epoxy fill after you do the glue up, let me know in the comments why that way is better. I honestly just want to learn. Now because these boards are as big as they are and I only have a 6-inch joiner, I'm going to use my track saw for edge joining because I think that gives me the best chance to have a clean edge for glue up. If I didn't have a track saw, I'd probably use a jointing jig or a straight line ripping jig at the table saw, and it's all about margin for error. I think that would have a better chance at achieving a seamless glue up than say a circular saw with a straight edge. Another option if you don't have a track saw is to use a router. A router with a flush trim bit and a long straight piece of MDF should yield the same results. With that said, I love the speed and quality of cut I get when using the track saw for this. And it's probably actually the cleanest of all the options too. Now after making sure I have my dedicated ripping blade and my table saw, I go ahead and square up that last edge. And after getting all the boards square, I'll spare you guys of having to watch it, but I go through the process of situating the boards in preparation for glue up. And this is based solely on aesthetics, flipping the boards top to bottom, front to back, deciding who sits next to who, all in preparation for glue up. And after I do that, I have everything labeled like you see here. I'm using the domino for this glue up, so the L and the T just indicates where I'm going to put a loose mortise and a tight mortise. I like having one loose mortise because it just makes the glue up a little bit easier. And the domino here is not for strength, it's just for alignment to keep the boards coplanar, so it's all good. Also of note, I'm not putting dominoes too close to the end because I'm still going to need to trim this tabletop down to size, and I do not want to cut into a domino when I do that. That would suck, and it would look terrible, and it would suck. If I didn't have a domino, I could use biscuits, dowels, or nothing. If I didn't use anything, I would make sure I use cauls. And between the biscuits and the dowels, I'd go biscuits for sure. You don't really need the extra strength that dowels would provide. And fitting all those dowels into those tiny holes for this size glue up would be a pain in the rump. Believe me, I know. So the glue up went pretty well, but I wish I would have cleaned off more of the glue before it dried, because I'd pay the price later when sanding. I also wish I would have been a little more thoughtful about removing that last clamp, because now I have a heavy, flat tabletop on a flat floor. How am I going to get this up? Well, this is kind of ridiculous, embarrassing, and annoying all at the same time. Part of me is like, well, this is kind of awesome because at least I know my tabletop's flat, so, that's a win. Then again, maybe it's just as warped as my shop floor. I don't know. We can't worry about that now. We just have to get this thing off the ground. I debated using a hand chuck, but I didn't want to risk damaging it. Then I remember I had one of those plastic spreader things. That'll probably work. It's kind of silly, but it did work. I was able to get it off the ground. And it's good to know that the build will continue. I didn't have to scrap the whole thing and turn this into a walnut rug for my shop or something. Now, sanding is typically my least favorite part about any project, and this one was no different. So I'm not going to make you sit here and watch that. But in case you're curious about my process, I started 80 grit and worked my way up to 180 grit. I mark up the table with a pencil in between each grit to ensure that I'm not missing any spots. And at 180 grit, I'll raise the grain with a spray bottle and sand it down again. Sanding is not difficult, it's just time consuming, but super important to the finished product. So the final length of this table is going to be 84 inches, or 7 feet, or some amount of meters. And I believe I had about 3 inches total to remove. So I wanted to take off as close to the same amount from each end as I could, because I do have dominoes in there and I do not want to cut through those. So I have one side cut. Let's see how she turned out. And looking good, and no dominoes. That's a win. As I put a 45-degree chamfer on the underside of this tabletop, the keen-eyed among you will notice that the corners of the table are no longer square. They're round. That can easily be done with one of those corner radius templates in a router, but I don't have one of those. So I had to do it the old-fashioned way. But I lost my landscape footage for that. But I did make a vertical form short of the process, so I'll link that in the description if you care to see it. And as for the underside chamfer, it's simply a design detail to make the tabletop appear thinner. The top will get a 1/8 inch round over. Okay, onto the base. Hey, and while you're clicking on links to shorts, I have another one showing how I made this table leg template. Okay, that's it. No more links to shorts, I promise. Unfortunately, whilst I was making this table, my bandsaw bit the dust. So I had to rough cut out these table legs with my jigsaw. But what are you going to do? Alright, so it's woodworking quiz time. True or false? After you glue up, route, and sand your tabletop, you should then use it as a makeshift workbench. If you said false, then congratulations. You probably don't have to worry about cutting into your tabletop with a jigsaw like I did here. And the thing is, I saw the clamp sliding. I just forgot I was on my tabletop instead of my workbench. And the damage wasn't even really that bad. It was more frustrating than anything. Really, even just, watching this back while doing the voiceover just really kind of burns me up, to be honest. And I wish I would have had the presence of mind to bring the camera in closer to show you the damage, but at this point I wasn't even thinking about the camera. And I was going over the options in my head on whether I wanted to cut off a 1/16 of an inch off the end of the table and redo the corners and everything, but like I said, it's not even that bad. I just decided to sand it and call it a day. But at this moment, I just needed to take a walk. All right, it's a new day. And as you can see, the tabletop is no longer there. I took it in the house, and now I'm working on my workbench like I should have been the whole time. We're looking to flush trim these table legs up, and since I did use a jigsaw to rough cut them out, there's a little bit more meat on the bone than I would have liked. Had my bandsaw been working, I could have been a little bit more precise and gotten closer to the line, but it wasn't working, so this is what we have. So with all that extra material to remove, and the fact that these legs are 1.5 inches thick, I needed a big router bit. So I went to the interwebs and I found this monster. This is a flush trim bit by Infinity Cutting Tools, and it's easily the biggest router bit that I have, and really the biggest router bit that I've ever seen, for that matter. I could have gotten the job done with some other bits that I have, but that would involve multiple passes and changing out bits, and I wanted to get the job done in one pass, so we decided to go this route. Plus, I mean, who doesn't like getting a new tool? Okay, so spoiler alert, this router bit works great, but I wanted to point out a few things. One, this router table is kind of cheap, and it doesn't have a starter pin, so I used the fence as a pivot point to start the routing, so I didn't just start routing freehand. And two, I don't know if you saw it, but I slowed the router speed way down to 16,000 RPM. And three, even though it looks like I'm going pretty fast here, I'm really not. I'm taking my time. It took about 5 minutes per leg, and I went even slower around the end grain. And yes, I do have dust collection, but for some reason this vacuum port has grids on it, so it renders it wholly ineffective when there's shavings this size. Great, so I love the way this turned out. But one thing I didn't show was that I used the tapering jig to cut off about a 32nd of an inch at the top of the leg where it's going to meet the rail. The flush trim bit worked as good as I would have hoped, but I just wanted to make sure that I had a perfectly seamless glue joint, so I took care of that part of the table saw. And speaking of rails, I'm cutting those down to size here. And the reason I'm showing this in real time versus being sped up is because I want to make a point about tear out. Even though I have a zero clearance plate, most of the tear out is going to happen in the back, and I don't have a zero clearance backer plate. But if you have a good blade with enough teeth, this one has 80, and you go slowly enough, I find that you really don't have to worry about tear out, at least not in my experience. Okay, so it's time to create a union between these legs and these rails. I'm taking my time to make sure that the ends are flush before I mark where I want to put the dominoes. It's not that consequential where you put the dominoes, just make sure you have enough space. Earlier when gluing up the tabletop, I was saying that I'd rather use biscuits than dowels because I didn't really need the extra strength. But that's not the case here. You would definitely rather go with dowels than biscuits here because you need that extra strength. Of course, I suppose if you're in a sentimental mood, you can probably do some good old-fashioned mortise and tenon joinery. Yeah, maybe I'll try that one day. Maybe. But this will do for now. Since these table legs are angled, you're going to need something to keep the clamps from sliding. And I've tried the blue tape and CA glue method in the past, and it does work sometimes. But then there are times where the tape doesn't hold enough and it still slides. So this is just a piece of pine that I've put a few dabs of glue on, and I'm gluing it directly to the table leg. But don't worry, it comes off, I promise. And I'm not sure if you need to, but I put glue in the mortise and on the face of the joint. I mean, it's not that much extra glue, and it can't hurt, so why not? Now this base is going to be longer than any of the parallel clamps that I have, but honestly, pound for pound or dollar for dollar, I think pipe clamps are some of the best clamps that you could buy. For this glue up specifically, I went to the store and bought a 10-foot pipe and had them cut it into 2 different sections. They'll cut it for free, they thread it for free, and now I have 2 clamps from 1 bar. So now I'll have a 7-foot clamp and a 3-foot clamp. And I don't even know if they make a 7-foot parallel clamp, but if they do, it probably costs as much as a saw stop. Plus, I think pipe clamps are just easier to use. They exert a ton of force really quickly and easily too. But I have both, and I use them both. I just think pipe clamps are vastly underrated. But there you have it. Clamp ran over. Let's set these things aside and let them dry. And while that dries, we're going to cut the same 15-degree angle that's on the legs onto the short rail. And you'll see in a little bit, but I actually should not have done this here. It would have been better if I would have waited and done a dry fit and then cut off the excess then. And if you're thinking, that's a long short rail, then I'd agree with you. It's actually one piece that's going to be cut down into 2 final length pieces at the miter saw. See, told you it would come off. Just a couple blows from the mallet and there's no damage at all, just a few dabs of glue to clean up and we're good to go. I decided to route a 45-degree chamfer along the inside of the legs and the long stretcher. I really like the look of the straight edge profile going with the curve of the leg. And I actually decided to make a second pass with the router to make the chamfer a little bit heavier. So I put a straight edge profile on the curved part of the leg, and I want to put a curved profile on the straight part of the leg. And since I wanted the whole outside of the leg to be curved instead of just a roundover on the corners, I had to have a roundover bit that was half the size of the thickness of the legs. And since these legs are 1.5 inches thick, that means I had to get a 3/4 inch radius roundover bit. And because I wanted to avoid any burning or tear out, I just made multiple passes, lowering the bit each time until I was able to get the full roundover on each side. After that, I just do a little bit of cleanup, little final shaping by hand with a sanding block. There you have it. I really like the way these turned out. All that routing, as you can imagine, left a bit of a mess, but it was worth it. So I was planning on not putting the dominoes in and dry fitting the base, but things did not go according to plan, as you can see from those domino plugs. Turns out there's some kind of math involved when you're dealing with dominoes and bevels. But no worries, we cut out the dominoes, flush cut them up, and look to find a solution that does not involve math or a time machine. I thought about using dowels with little dowel pins to mark the dowel markings, but that seemed more tedious than what I wanted to do. So I went with the old tried and true, pocket holes. And yes, the pocket holes will be unseen and they will be plenty strong enough. Unless you want to go coyote ugly on this table, at which point I can make no guarantees. So if you've been watching this long, thank you. I sincerely hope you've been enjoying the build so far. And if you want to tackle this build yourself, I'll have plans available with a link in the description. I'll also post links to any of the tools that I use during this build. And those links, most of them probably, will be affiliate links. And if you use them to purchase something, that just means I'll receive a small commission at no cost to you. So if you do decide to use them, thank you for that. That helps out the channel a ton. But if you don't decide to use them, just the fact that you watched the video this far is awesome too. So thank you for that. All right, back to the build. So I've been gluing this base up with pretty much no incident. Nothing special here. Just gluing the mortises and on the faces. And when it comes to clamping, I want to have clamps on both sides of the workpiece so that I'll have even clamping pressure. When I put the first set of clamps on, the joint wasn't closing properly at both ends. So putting that second set of clamps on cleared that up. Then we just check for square and we're good. This build has been a lot of fun and we're coming down the home stretch. And for the finish, we're using Rubio Monocoat Pure. It really is super easy to apply. First I just trowel it on, then I buff it in with a white Scotch-Brite pad. And after I let it sit for about 10 or 15 minutes, I come back with the shop towels to wipe off the excess. And I'm making sure I switch out the shop towels as needed because you want to make sure you get all of the excess off. Leaving too much on is a big no-no. And when using Rubio on Walnut, you really do need to use 2 coats. So I'll usually come back about a day or so later and put a maroon pad in my random orbital sander and go over the whole surface until there's a haze covering the entire table. Then come back and wipe it off with a clean rag, and then I'm ready to put on the second coat. The second coat goes on just like the first, and it really does step up the sheen. If you don't want this level of sheen, I would still recommend doing 2 coats, but instead I would just sand to 120 or 150 instead of going all the way to 180. Because not only is one coat kind of matte in its appearance, but it also seems a little bit cloudy, at least in my experience. Oh, and when I finish with the rags, I lay them flat because I don't want to start any fires. To attach the tabletop, I like to go with the figure 8 fasteners. I have 2 short rails and 2 cross supports, and I'm only putting fasteners in those. I'm not putting any in the long rails. And that's because wood expands and contracts along its width. So the figure 8s on the short rails allow it to move side to side. If I put them on the long rails, the side-to-side movement of the figure 8 fasteners wouldn't match the direction of the wood as it expands and contracts, unless my figure 8 fasteners had elongated holes, which these don't. I elected to go with these felt pads instead of leg levelers because the legs are level. It's all good. And there you have it, a modern dining room table for my family to enjoy for hopefully years to come. This build was a lot of fun. I learned a few new things, used some new tools, made a few mistakes, but it's all right. We fixed them. In the end, I'm super happy with the build, the way it turned out, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video. All right, take it easy.